And we are live. Tonight we're going to do things a little bit different. It's not a state story, and it's not even a fun event, so to speak. But what it is something that will hopefully bring us back to an idea of who we are as a people, where we've come from, what it means to be European, and what that particular area of the world was going through. We grew up and we had this idea that you had Rome and you had the heights of Rome. Bernard Cornwell, he writes about this in his Anglo-Saxon saga, and he talks about how various identities in Britain, they could see the heights from which they fell. And that's sort of how it was taught to us, is that there was this great fall. Technology isn't always moving up. It's not completely linear, but there's peaks and valleys. And so oftentimes it was told to us that I was spitting in a bowl and drinking the spit afterwards. And it was this great time of filth and of idiocy. But there were glimpses that maybe that wasn't the whole story. And we had those glimpses in the Arthurian legends. We had those glimpses in all of the fun books that we enjoyed reading and got glimpses of maybe in feudalism, in these identities, there was more. And whether it was Tolkien, whether it was Adams, or whether it was Lewis with Narnia, you get into the Prydain saga, there's all these ideas that maybe there was more to the Dark Ages, to medieval times, than just a restaurant in Florida or just these fun library books. So, in light of that, and with the great blessing of the internet, and that we're seeing these ideas of French knights, that we're digging into Templars, and we're seeing that there was more going on in medieval times than trying to reach back to the heights of Rome, I happened to stumble across Memory Medieval. So, sir, go ahead and introduce yourself and explain to us what makes you tick. What is sort of your identity on the internet?
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. My project is sort of a long-winded way to get about to come around to producing historical artwork, I guess, as you can see behind me. And so I've really jumped back into medieval history, and I've been really getting into it for the last few years. And that's just sort of what I do in all my free time, is just read about medieval history, post about medieval history, and I've got a podcast which it comes out twice a month, and I have usually historians come on the podcast, sometimes other enthusiasts. So that's twice a month for the project. I just started a digital publication called Feigned Flight Magazine, which is dedicated to have a little bit more of a conceptual look at the medieval period. And so we're paying authors to write for us, to write essays basically on various sort of conceptual looks at the medieval period. As a quick example, the first one that we published was on medieval oaths. So, the swearing of oaths and fealty and generally feudalism. But the real concept of the piece was about what words meant then and what words mean now, and sort of what's the importance of the meaning of words, which I thought was a really excellent piece. So I've got that going, and then later this year I'll be doing a Kickstarter to put out some custom medieval themed playing cards that are illustrated by me. So
Yes.
this is sort of like, a long, I've got a lot of irons in the fire. I've got a lot of things going on, but I'm sort of in the medieval history all day, as much as I can. And my real areas of familiarity, I suppose you could say, is French history, specifically Norman history, revolving around Richard the Lionheart or the Italian Normans. Those are kind of my real areas where I feel comfortable speaking with some confidence, I suppose you could say. But medieval history, I mean, as a historian, it's a period of 1,000 years, and there's lots of places, lots of different things going on. So a normal historian may only pick one figure or one century in one particular place to look at. So
yes,
it's not easy to get. It takes a long time, I should say, to get a very comprehensive view, if you will.
Are you familiar with the? He is. I don't even know how you would describe him. Anyways, he and I were talking one time on stream, and it was this idea that it was still the medieval period when the Spanish discovered the New World. And that, it's like I should have recognized it, but that was mind blowing.
Yeah, you have Columbus alive. I believe his life sort of crosses over with Vlad Tepes. Vlad Dracula. Basically, their lives cross over, and Vlad is over in Wallachia fighting the Ottomans at the same time, or just roughly before Columbus sets out for the New World.
Yes, very good. All right, so you've mentioned Italians, you've mentioned French. What are the wide sweeps of the continent in contrast to what would become the United Kingdom? And how does this start playing into the Italians, into the French, into the movements of, again, what would become the United Kingdom? Because all of this, it seems in my mind, is very much interconnected. And there's a few standouts with the Nordic peoples, and a little bit of push and pull with German separation, or excuse me, Germanic separation versus Celts, sort of paint the broad picture for us moving into medieval times, that period.
So I'll try to give you a rough. We'll jump around a little bit, I suppose, because
Yes.
it's we could talk maybe if you want to start with England. I suppose England
Okay.
actually relative to the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages is a very the term has a lot of meanings for a lot of different people. I suppose you could say.
Yes.
And so a historian now would tell you that the Dark Ages means that they just had a lack of sources. And in particular, this particularly, I think, applies to Britain. Uh, They experienced sort of with the withdrawal of Rome, they experienced sort of the most, or in some ways, relatively, they experienced some of the most collapse, you could say, sort of a return to the tribalism maybe that existed before Rome, and so they went through a period where it was actually much more subsistence style living, and not particularly lavish or extravagant or sophisticated. So in some ways, you can characterize, I think, England maybe through 500 to about 800 to 900. You can say that maybe is sort of emblematic of what people think of when they are referring, to the Dark Ages. England then in about 900, Alfred comes along and he sort of unites these petty kingdoms at the same time that the Vikings are repeatedly invading England and ravaging land. So he sort of beats them back, establishes his kingdoms, and sort of creates a stable England, as it were. The Normans, William the Conqueror, will eventually come and conquer England in 1066. And that's sort of where we start to get, like Norman castle building, a lot more Norman culture. You get the Angevin Empire, and a lot more of the history is a lot more familiar out of that.
So
In the
is this the high medieval period? Are we
so
are we starting to enter into
Yeah,
that?
so the high medieval period, I think, is roughly 1000 to 1300. I think is what it's typically referred to, and then the late medieval period would be 1300 to 1500. Although it depends on who you talk to. A lot of people will say it ends at different times. Some people say that it ends with the fall of Constantinople in
Yes.
1453. Some people will say that it ends with Columbus in 1492. My personal opinion is it ends with the death of Bayard in 1524. But there's a lot of different people who have a lot of different opinions about that.
Sure.
But yeah, roughly 1000 to 1300 is going to be
Okay.
the high medieval period.
Yes.
So Spain sort of at the very beginning of this, the collapse of the Vandal kingdoms and so forth after the collapse of Rome, Spain basically gets invaded and taken over by the Muslims. And I want to say, wow, how am I forgetting this one? I just looked it up the other day. I want to say late 500s, or maybe it's the early 700s. Pelagius of Asturias, basically with a couple hundred guys in the mountains, begins the Reconquista, where he, as I guess what maybe the last king of the Vandals, so called, begins fighting back against the Muslims. He wins the Battle of Covadonga, where he comes out of these cliffs and surprises this Muslim army, and kills the leader and drives them off. And that sort of begins the Reconquista, which is a 700-year process, I believe, roughly, of Spain sort of establishing these little tiny kingdoms, Navarre and Castile, and a couple other ones that sort of, when they're not fighting with each other, they're sort of moving against the Muslims and sort of pushing them down the peninsula until eventually, in I believe it's actually 1453 as well, 1454. No, I forget the exact date. The Reconquista is not my specialty. Where they finally, I believe it's take the city of Granada and expel the Muslims from the peninsula for good. So Spain basically went through this long process over the course of the Middle Ages of starting very quickly of getting taken over and having a heavy Muslim influence, and then this process of these sort of like small petty kingdoms going through the process of the Reconquista, and pushing the Muslims back, basically, and eventually uniting into what is Spain and Portugal.
Sure. Okay. So you have the fall of the Latin Roman kingdom. You have the invasion of the Muslims. Up north, you have the various Nordic tribes that would engage in Viking activities. What is the culture? What is the group of people that stand in contrast to, for lack of a better, to the invaders in all areas? What is that group of people that makes up medieval society? Are these former Roman entities? Is it former Roman blood? Who are these peoples? Is it, do we just run to Charlemagne and say that, yes, these were Germanics? Who are the medieval people?
Charlemagne's a big one.
Sure.
Charlemagne's a pretty big one and a pretty important one, although the Franks are Germanic tribes themselves. The Anglo-Saxons via, that period, and then coming out with Alfred are another, but they too were Germanic tribes. I mean, you can think of maybe the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons as maybe sort of the two most prolific, although relative to European influence, I think is maybe the way to say it, because of course, like the Norwegians and the Scandinavians generally, they obviously ruled their own, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, the whole time themselves. So they sort of seemed, as far as I can tell, I haven't dived into it too deeply, but they sort of just kind of did their own thing. They were sort of like France light in a way. They had kings and they sort of had a little bit of a feudal system. They eventually acquired Iceland. That's kind of a pretty interesting. I've just learned about Iceland recently. Medieval Iceland was pretty wild. But they were sort of just doing their own thing up there in Scandinavia. They weren't too involved, although there are exceptions. I believe it's Sigmund the First who actually sailed all the way around Europe right after the First Crusade, and sailed to the Holy Land and helped capture a city and did some fighting, and then sailed all the way back to Scandinavia, all the way back around Europe. So there were some notable exceptions of a handful of guys during that period that sort of interacted with wider Europe. But outside of the Viking invasions, and I suppose outside of Iceland, there wasn't too much crossover. Not too much.
Okay. So last question as we sort of set the stage for this, and then we're going to dig into the mindset and to the foundational texts to get into that mindset. The Great Schism there in, was it 1054?
Sounds right.
Okay, ish. So Great Schism happens. How much of an impact on medieval Europe, on the mindset, on not necessarily the workings of the church, but the common man? How did that affect him? Did it affect him?
So I think you could apply the same thing. My answer to this is going to apply the same thing that you could say with medieval rulers as far as the laws that they make. I think medieval Christianity, as far as the influence of the Pope or the influence of the patriarchs or the influence of a particular church, they had more influence the closer in proximity that you were to the thing. So a king can make a law, and this is one of the reasons why earlier kings, in particular, like Charlemagne or Henry II, notoriously, he rode around so much that he apparently just had sore legs all the time. A big part of we think of kingship as like the king is in the castle, but the king, especially for the first half of the medieval period, would have been traveling quite a bit because he needed, in part, to enforce his various laws, check in on his vassals, his subordinates, and kind of make sure that everything's going as he would like it to be. And it's kind of the same thing with Christianity. It would be possible, I think, quite possible to. Are you still there?
I
Okay.
am. Can you
All
hear
right.
me all right?
Yeah, you're
Yeah,
good. You're
it
good.
seemed to slip there for a second.
No problem.
So I believe the last thing I heard was it would be quite possible.
It would be quite possible to be a medieval Christian and kind of know nothing about the Pope or nothing about what the Pope is doing or the patriarchs or whatever, if you're kind of far out from wherever the Pope or the patriarchs are. It's not like today where we sort of have, the Pope can say something and you hear it immediately on the internet or something like this. So the influence that the Pope had or the patriarchs would have been fairly restricted to their close geographic area, certainly for the first half of the medieval period, because in the earlier part of the medieval period, there was a lot of anti-popes, there was a lot of uh, contested popeships, or however you would say it. There was a lot of fighting
Yes.
over who's going to be pope and who actually is pope. It can be heavily determined whether they actually have any power or influence to do anything. So I think this is actually one of the things that I would say is sort of what makes the medieval period a little bit difficult for sort of a quick soundbite or for to get across quite easily, is because there's a lot of paradoxes and a lot of variance in a lot of the things that are happening, where you can have people that are both pious and violent at the same time. You can have people that are Christians and have no idea who the Pope is at the same time, or or those types of things. There's a lot of paradoxes and a lot of variance with what is actually going on.
Okay. Perfect. All right. So I don't want to be too harsh, and I don't want to paint them as ignorant, but there is, like you've mentioned, there was sort of this lack of information that was traveling, and so there was a local identity that found particular expressions of Christendom, of the royal blood, things of that nature. Okay, perfect. So we've sort of laid this out. How do we get into the medieval mindset when we start jumping into history? When we look at how these people were acting inside the world, what does that mean? And it's a big topic. How does it stand in contrast to how we operate today? What was the driving? What was sort of the hat trick of medieval times? If there were three things that formed it, what was that? Or maybe there was only one thing that drove the medieval mind. I'm just trying to tease out and pull what was the medieval mind.
Well, I think there are some things that, and this is, I guess, let me stipulate. This is my opinion and sort of how I view it now, after sort of going through lots of different sources and studying a lot of
Yes.
different parts of the history. Because I'm sure that there's going to be again, a variety of answers that people would have for something like this. In my view, I think generally they are sincere is maybe not the right word, but maybe earnest is maybe the more the correct word. Earnest and pragmatic, I think,
Okay.
are two of the main things that really strike me. Reading a lot of their stories and even a lot of the primary texts. Maybe sincerity, some sort of combination of earnestness and sincerity. The, and which isn't to say, of course, I'm not saying that they can't be flippant or some guys are bad or nonchalant or whatever is the thing, but there's a certain amount of with pragmatism for example, there was a lot of real consequences to things. So if you start harassing the peasants, as the Italian Normans did, then next year there's a famine. And and when there's a famine, more peasants die, and that's bad. And people get angry, and then they start assassinating you. So there's sort of I can't say immediate, I suppose, but sort of quick consequences that maybe we're a little
Yes.
less familiar with in today's world, I suppose. There's a lot of insulation from consequences, and there's a lot of um, perhaps maybe the word is state dabbling in consequences or administrative dabbling in consequences to where
Okay.
maybe you think there should be a consequence for something, but actually that's not exactly how things work. So, um, there was that sort of environment when you're living in that environment where there were particular times and places. In fact, even early in Charlemagne's reign, where there were a lot of places that were living a very subsistence lifestyle
Yes.
and starving to death. And that was actually one of Charlemagne's big things is that I forget exactly how he worded, but no Frank should starve to death while I'm the king. Something to that effect.
Sure.
And so there was a lot of immediate hardship. If you didn't perform the way that you were supposed to perform, there were consequences. And a
Right.
lot of kings found that out as well. I'm not just talking about farmers, even. A lot of kings found that out with the way that they treated their vassals, or the way that they, in particular, behaved with their allies or their enemies.
Well,
There,
it makes sense as you're describing all this, the immediacy of things. It does seem that it would naturally foster an earnestness and a sincerity because not to, anyways, winter is coming, and
sure.
it is there in every year, and you're getting maybe 4 or 5 months where you can not worry about it as much, but the immediacy of that cycle is routinely there. And it seems like, yeah, the easiest thing to jump into would be some form of sincerity and honesty because regardless of whatever else is going on, the snow is coming.
Right, and they were very much, at the mercy of the weather, at the mercy of the
Yes.
harvest, at the mercy of the decisions that their superiors made. And so there was, I think, but there's also a pragmatism about things. I think we have this idea that, like, well, if you're doing one thing, then you just have to keep doing that thing. But there's a lot of switching alliances, or changing your mind, or doing something different very quickly, because you're sort of there on the ground, and you have to decide that the consequences that are coming from the way I was doing things are not the consequences that I want. So I need to do
Yeah.
something else. So there's definitely a very healthy pragmatism. I think a lot of this gets misunderstood as cynicism, but I think, like, the way that I read, like, when I encounter them, even in their own texts, I don't really get a lot of cynicism. I think pragmatism is fair.
Mhm.
Consequences are real. But I think that there's a tendency through sort of modern materialism or rationalism that sort of simply, this idea that, like, I'm smart if I have clever thoughts. Their idea would have been that, like, you're smart if you get a good result. Their idea would have been that somebody who's beautiful on the outside, that's actually an indication of internal beauty. So, like, when you see these anecdotes of, like, oh, this king was extremely beautiful, he was a beautiful young man, or the most handsome man in the world, this type of thing. They're actually not trying to say that he was actually maybe looked the best. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. What they're trying to say is that he possessed, sort of the highest internal virtues. He was a
Yes.
virtuous man, and he had these internal qualities. So they had, and I think in a lot of ways, we think about um, materialism, rationalism, sort of, semantics, and these other types of things that we have more prominent now. In a way, I think that's divorced, and I mean the same thing with sort of the way that we live, right? Like, we're sort of having this conversation on the internet, on screens. They would have had conversations in person, or you would have had to dictate a letter and receive a letter that is read to you, most likely read to you. And their dealings were a lot more personal. They were a lot more connected to nature. The consequences were a lot more direct. Everything was just simpler. Is maybe not, I'm not trying to say that things weren't complex, but they were a lot more
Sure.
straightforward. And because
Yes.
of that, I think that nowadays it's sort of very easy for people to sort of be clever or fake clever or duplicitous or
Yes.
uh, shifty, sort of to have a very amorphous personality. And it was much more difficult back then. And of course, life was much more brutal and violent. And one of my favorite lines from Wickham's Medieval Europe, which is kind of an overview of the period, one of the lines that stuck with me is he said, all the peasants carried knives and they used them. And life was violent. They had a high infant mortality rate. They had public executions. They were very familiar with the smell of death, as it were. And so I think that just they were just much more, ironically on the stream, they were just much more in touch with reality. I think,
Yes.
or maybe or in touch with their reality relative to how we are with ours.
So I don't want to go too far off into the weeds with this, but as you're speaking, I'm trying to think of an analogous period to this, and the first one that's coming to my mind is westward expansion in North America, and in particular that period of the Wild West. Uh, is that is that too far out there? Are there some noticeable parallels there? Whether it's public execution, whether it is the immediacy of one's actions, that do echo sort of the medieval framework. Maybe even uh, a responsibility on personhood.
I think there's definitely some threads there. I'm not a super expert on the Wild West, but I think there's definitely some through lines. And I think what's exceptional about the medieval period is that, in my opinion, I suppose, what's exceptional is that if you take Rome, for example, or you take America with the Wild West as, or, the settling and then the Wild West and sort of early America. If you look at Rome and America, you sort of have this. In Rome, you have the early Republic, and in America, you have the 13 colonies, Revolutionary War, and settling, the early Republic, I suppose you could call it. And both of these entities become much more administrative, bureaucratic. They become empires, as I think is fair to say. And you end up with the way that sort of changes people, because the people become more administrative. They become, you got to become cleverer. There's a lot more division of labor. There's a lot more, um, just a lot more. I think the division of labor is maybe the right way to think of it, in that you're sort of divorced, not just from the other labors that you could do, but sort of the other facets of life. You end up with these very decadent elite classes that are very removed from sort of the everyday aspect of things. And I think what's really unique about the medieval period, actually, I should preface that also by saying that the purpose, or a main driver of that, is sort of the increase in wealth and luxury.
Ooh.
And uh,
So that's interesting. It seems to have dropped me. Okay.
oh, am I back?
Yeah, I see you. Can you
Okay,
hear me?
perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah,
Odd.
that's interesting. So, what I should say is, I think a big driver of that is like the increase in wealth and luxury. And you do see something similar in the end of the medieval period, with a lot more decadence in wealth and luxury, sort of famously, I suppose, with maybe Henry VIII.
Hmm.
But although, maybe he's a little more early modern, but you get the idea. But what's really unique about the medieval period is they were able to develop a lot of sophistication and a lot more luxury, a lot more material goods. They could have material progress, but it didn't cause, because there was no, I suppose, singular empire. It was very um, decentralized, is the word I'm looking for. They were able to maintain sort of this, people still being tied to their to where they were, sort of tied to their feudal reality, I suppose maybe is the way to put it, where you
Yes.
still had early on in the medieval period, you would have warrior elites. Of course, all of the kings and nobles were all fighters, and that still is true 1,000 years later.
What an
Um,
idea.
and yeah, so but that's that's obviously in pretty stark contrast with the Roman Empire, less so, but still in contrast, and certainly with with America today. And so I think you end up with this really interesting look of the way that humans are and developed and behaved in this place where they experienced a similar sort of increase in wealth and sophistication, but without the sort of the decadence, if you will, in a way, and decadence and decline because of the the elites still had to be fighters, really, until you started getting into the gunpowder era. The
Yes.
nobles had to still fight, so that sort of kept them on the ground, sort of kept them, uh,
Humbled them.
yeah, kept them humble, kept them in line, kept them
Yes.
sort of still at the whims of. It still kept them at the whims of the people who they allegedly represented,
Yes.
which
Well,
is
and I'm thinking that as well as divine mercy at that point. Um, if you're walking into the fight, if you're walking into siege weapons, if you're walking into the potential for arrows and death coming without you looking for it.
yeah, I think there was a lot of understanding that you had to be right with God at all
Yes.
times. And there was I think, again, I think there was an earnestness about that. And this is something that, I think this is something that the modern mind has a lot of trouble with, in particular with the medieval period, is this idea that you can have guys who will wake up and attend a brief mass and say their prayers and their confession and all this stuff, and put on a suit of armor and go out and kill people, and that somehow is the same guy who's not he's not faking either one. He's not sort of
Yes.
obviously he's not faking being violent, but he's also not faking being pious. And so the modern mind has a lot of trouble with those types of, I guess, what we would consider to be paradoxes.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Well, and I'm listening to it, and sort of the two things that are echoing are one, just remember being in school and then growing up, and eventually you run into somebody that says, "Aren't you so glad you don't live under a king? Aren't you so glad that you get to operate within democracy? You get, this political season." And I think to myself, at least with a king, even if he's a terrible king, let's just assume that he's a terrible king. You There is a centralization of power, and who it is that is coming against you and seeking ill for you. So that's the one thing. But then the second thing that just continues to echo is it is this amazing contrast. You're talking about going to mass and then going to war in the same day, in the same 6 hour period. Um, and I'm thinking at the same time, what is it that just drove these men and women to beauty, to I don't want to say the divine, that's almost too simple, but to something transcendent, right? Because we operate in this great malaise at this point, and we're overwhelmed with sorrow, and SSRIs are exploding, and we seem incapable of dealing with the mundane and the trite. And yet we look back 1,000 years and they were just pursuing beauty. How does that happen? And do you think it is just how extreme life is and how tenuous life was at that point, that they to even operate within it, they had to be going all gas no brakes? Is that part of it?
There's definitely a certain aspect to that. I think the all gas, no brakes. I think And that's one of the reasons I love the Normans.
Yes. Okay.
The Normans were just the pinnacle of that for at least the century. They were the masters of Europe. Uh, I think there's kind of two things going on. Maybe, well, I guess let me say three things about that. The first thing I'll say is, I think that there was a certain sincerity. It varied, but I think there is a certain sincerity of the way that they believed in God, and that they either were encouraged or felt, a certain responsibility to um, produce things that were, beautiful and great, or whatever, to honor God. I mean, cathedrals are obviously one that are pretty obvious. This is something that I've posted about quite a bit and gotten some heat on because, it's pretty ridiculous to imagine. I mean, I think it's we don't build cathedrals like that for the most part. There's a real handful of projects, so that's not entirely true. But for the most part, we don't
Sure.
build projects like that today because we don't believe the same things in the same way. And if there was the willpower to do that, then we would do it. But those types of projects were generational projects for them. A lot of those
Yes.
cathedrals took 50, 100, 200, some 600 years. And to produce a project like that, you're not looking for a short-term profit. You're not looking for an immediate return for your shareholders. If you want those types of things, you're not going to do that type of project. So
Yes.
I think that there's a certain, there's definitely a certain aspect to the mindset there. So there is a sincerity or earnestness, I suppose. Maybe I'm going to
Yeah.
repeat myself a lot, so I apologize,
No, no,
about the way
it's
that they believed in God. I think the other thing is that there was a real, like, all gas, no brakes, like you say, there is a real, because of the reality of consequences, there was
yes.
a legitimate competition between nobles and various countries, various kingdoms. There was a real competition between each other because if you were slipping, you never know who the next guy to come over the hill is. You never know who's going to try to take your spot, whether it's from within the kingdom, who's not going to like you. Maybe it's one of your relatives, or you don't know
Yes.
if, the Mongols are going to come over the hills or whatever. So this isn't to say that everybody was in peak form and performing at the top all the time, but there was a certain reality that if you're not performing in peak form, then you're opening yourself up to whoever feels like you're not performing in peak form
Sure.
and thinks that they can do better.
It was a higher average.
Yeah. And I think the last thing is that I don't want to. I think we also shouldn't attribute, perhaps, although it certainly depends, because Charlemagne, he was very inspired by Rome, and he very much wanted to continue the legacy of the Roman project. That was hugely
Yes.
inspirational
Okay.
for him. Um, Not everybody was like that, though. But I should also say that I think what makes some of the great men great is that they were particularly violent and successful at being violent. And they also belonged to this culture where, art or sculpture or building cathedrals, Christendom, Christianity, came in behind them in the space that they created through their supreme violence. They may not have intended themselves to there are certain figures who maybe they themselves didn't intend to they may not have been that concerned with beautiful things or whatever is the
Yes.
case. They may have just been very violent, but through their violence they created the peaceful space behind them for those other things to flourish, because they also you know didn't hate them, or
Right.
whatever, however you want to describe, whatever they felt for it otherwise, but they weren't against it, and so
It's
those other things were able to flourish.
oh, I want to ask a chicken and egg question, and I'll describe it to you, but I'm worried that would take us too far down a different road. But just this idea of, was it Christianity that inspired some of these great leaders, or was it that some of these great leaders cleared out a path that Christianity could come into? Um, anyways,
It's a bit
I
of
feel like that could be a stream unto itself.
it's a bit of both, and it depends on who you're
Yes.
talking to. Certain
Okay.
ones, like you could look at somebody like Louis the Ninth, and he is extremely pious. I think
Yes.
extremely devout. Or you could look at somebody like Clovis or somebody like Rollo. They were hugely influential, both in Christianity coming behind them. Although you can read various stories about, perhaps they weren't the most sincere.
Right.
So it's sort of there's a huge variance there.
Okay. Perfect. So we've sort of laid out the map. We've put the pieces on the map. Tell me about books. Tell me about text. This is, obviously this is before the printing press. This is before um, the common man having access to any sort of text. What were the myths? What were the texts that were all over the medieval time and sort of drove these men and drove these families into this way of thinking and into piousness or what they were aspiring to participate in?
Well, it should be said, I suppose, at the beginning that the Bible was the most influential text.
Okay.
After that, so it of course I think depends on where in the period you are, because certain texts were influential at the beginning, and other texts didn't exist at the beginning. So like King Arthur is a perfect example where
Yes.
I don't think King Arthur came along until about the 11th century at the earliest, really about the 12th century. So
Originally
um,
Welsh. Yes.
I believe that's the historical origin of it.
Okay.
But there's uh,
It's
I suppose
contested.
there's some wiggle room there a little bit.
Okay.
So and some of these we don't have very good sources for. Other
Yes.
things like Beowulf, for example, was written and was basically not influential at all until Tolkien brought it back.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, Beowulf was not, as I understand, was not a very influential text. It wouldn't have been, 100 years ago, I guess, whatever's before Tolkien, you wouldn't have
Sure.
considered it one of the great books or one of the great pieces of literature.
Yes.
Tolkien is really the one who brought it into the spotlight, I suppose
Now
is
I'm going to show my ignorance. I can't remember. Beowulf was originally Scandinavian, or was it?
Old English. So
You're
like English,
right.
yeah, Old English.
Like I said, showing my ignorance.
It's all good. Yeah, Tolkien was a professor of Old English. I actually just did
Yes.
a stream on Old English, podcast on Old English. That's how I know that. Otherwise, I couldn't have told you.
Okay.
But
Very good.
yeah, so uh, a big one would have been Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. That would have
Yes.
been very influential for them in the early period, because
Okay.
Boethius was a Roman and who was executed. He wrote his sort of philosophy comes and visits him and consoles him as he's
Yes.
waiting to be executed. And so that was a very influential text, certainly for the early part of the medieval period. When and I suppose the Bible, aside from the Bible, I'm not sure which texts outside of Boethius for the early part.
Yeah, and so that was sort of where I was going to head. Is if we take the Bible almost, it's there. It is so there. It's not even foundational. It's just a part of their existence. And so then the
It's like
books
water
that,
for a fish.
yes,
With the exception of the pagan tribes that haven't converted yet,
fair,
but for Christendom, it's basically
yes.
the water for the fish. Yeah.
And is it fair? Is it fair to say that medieval times is the flourishing of Christendom, and frankly the conquering of a pagan European identity? Is
Yeah,
that very
I
much
think so.
part of the medieval identity?
Yeah, I think a big arc in the medieval period, I would say, is the uh, unification slash growth of power of Christianity and Christendom, and
Okay.
essentially, I would say, the eradication of paganism.
Okay. Certainly. So we have the Bible. So then, how are these regional texts, these various players, how are they operating within society? Are they more or less commentaries on Scripture? Is that how they're being approached? Are they just the writings of rich men who don't have to do as much? Which, as you've already said, that's not quite what was going on, because kings are leading from the front, knights are operating as martial careerists, is making light of what it is they're doing. But that was it's who they were, right? So I'm just trying to figure out what it means for books or texts at this point?
Well, books were extremely expensive.
Yes.
So you would have had to have been very wealthy to produce any books.
Yes.
And this is, I guess, this is sort of one of the things that is maybe a benefit of the Roman Empire or these giant administrative empires is that they're able to sort of centralize the wealth and divide the labor and, sort of create mints everywhere that can just mint coins or, places that can print books or not print, but, scribe, write down the books and copy the books.
Scriptorium.
Scriptorium,
Yeah.
nailed it. Um, so, there's but you're able to sort of centralize the resources. I mean, it's the same thing with the armies, they're able to centralize the resources and field armies that are in
Yes.
the tens of thousands very easily. Whereas in the medieval period, armies go down, there's conflicts of just, I think the Battle of Hastings was maybe, if I recall, which, relative to the Roman Empire or previous empire periods would have been considered extremely small. So, or I
It's
mean,
wild.
or the Normans conquering southern Italy, and over the course of several decades, turning it into a kingdom. They did that with maybe 5,000 total men, at my estimate, something like that, because
Yes.
the armies and everything are just so small and divided. The very pivotal Battle of Civitate was 3,500 Normans against a papal army that was 6,500. So that's, roughly about 10,000 guys total on the whole
Right.
battlefield. So, everything just got a lot more decentralized, a lot smaller, and books were a lot more expensive. Information
Sure.
in as we would think about it was a lot more expensive. So I think the way that, they would have had a network of churches. They would have had, which the monks, the priests. You'd have had sort of the clergy who were really in charge of creating manuscripts and reading and writing and passing on the information of the Bible. And the other thing to remember, I suppose, about the period is that mass, I think weekly mass would have really been an event for everybody.
Yes.
Although for the elite, a lot of them maybe would have attended mass more than once a week. I mean, I think Charlemagne went daily as often as he could, as his schedule would allow. And of course, if you
What a
were,
wild idea.
yeah,
A head of state attending mass multiple times a week.
yeah, and actually, there's an incredible section. I should have, if I would have thought about it. When next time you're talking, I'll pull it up here. But
Okay.
it's just an incredible passage talking about some of these figures in the later medieval period and sort of the paradoxical way in which they lived. But I guess back to your question, mass would have been an event, and
Yeah.
so and it would have been expected for everybody to have the day off, even if you're a simple laboring peasant, you would have had the day off, and even
Wow.
if you lived a half a day's walk away, it was expected that you would walk a half a day, go to mass, and then walk half a day back home, and then get back to your work and everything for the other 6 days. So there was a lot of community that happened around that, and a lot of sort of dispensing the general knowledge, I suppose, if you would, of Christianity through the mass. It wouldn't have
Yes.
been people wouldn't have had Bibles to read or that sort of thing, but they would have went to mass and heard the homilies and interacted with the clergy once a week. So they would have had, and this was, I think, pretty universal for the areas that were Christianized. So there would have been a lot of sort of uh, communal culture that revolved around that.
What I So here's one for you, and this is sort of asking you to reach into the clouds and find an answer. Um, Rome spreads out through Europe, but it's kind of sparse, kind of there, depending on which island or which portion of Europe you're in. What I'm trying to determine right now is what is it, either about European man or about Christianity, that found such fertile ground in medieval Europe? Was it a function of the time and the collapse of Rome? Was it a function of some sort of European? je ne sais quoi. Was it a function of Christianity? What was it that enabled the soil and the seeds to just combine in that moment in history? That we can see a more or less the same, whether it's the Spanish, whether it's there's some regional uh, eccentricities. There's some regional eccentricities, but it's more or less the same throughout the area. How in the world did that happen?
My thought on that would be that it kind of the same way with Rome, that you had, the Christianization of Rome. I think a very pivotal point for that would have been Constantine at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, where
Yes,
he has, the conversion ahead of time. He
the
sees
vision of the cross.
the vision,
Yeah.
vision of the cross, and then, basically says like, well, the Christian God likes me, so
Game over.
we're gonna worship that guy now.
Yes.
Clovis had a very similar experience actually at the Battle of Tolbiac, where he married his wife. I forget her name now, but she was actually Christian, so she was kind of nagging him. And he was in this battle, and apparently the battle's going poorly for him. And so he says at the battle, like, "Well, my wife's a Christian, so if a Christian God wants to pop down now, this would be the opportune time because things are going pretty poorly, and I guess I'll become Christian." And apparently, lo and behold, the tide of the battle turns, and he wins the Battle of Tolbiac and
Yes.
gets baptized. And that's, I guess, sort of important for that in particular because Clovis was extremely influential. So the Christianization of the Franks obviously leads down to Charlemagne, Charles Martel, and then Charlemagne. So it's I think my opinion of it would be that a sort of a handful of these particular elite conversions,
Okay.
um, Charlemagne or Clovis being one of them, and then you have a handful of influential leaders that come after him. Charlemagne, Charles Martel being one, Charlemagne being another, Pelagius who started the Reconquista. Alfred is obviously very Christian, and
Yes.
he's responsible for kicking out the Vikings and uniting the Kingdom of England. And so you have a handful of these guys who either converted or who Rollo is another one who he converted to Christianity after, I guess, sort of losing the siege of Chartres and Chartres, and
Yeah.
basically accepting the king's offer to become Normans, essentially.
Yeah. So if I'm catching what you're saying, where nobody's out in greater not Frankenreich, but we'll just call it France. Where we're out there, and all of a sudden, just these great leaders, almost like dominoes, start tipping over, and then it's almost like, well, if they're gonna do it, we've seen them lead from the front. We've seen them participating in and leading this life. I guess it would just make sense at that point to follow your leader.
Yeah, and I
And
think
at that point too, if you are of the Christian persuasion, or looking to be persuaded by Christianity, you're seeing the greater God interacting in this period of time.
well, and there's that, and then there's also sort of the transformation, I suppose, over generations. As people are born into one situation and their situation changes by the time that they die, but they're raising their kids in that new situation, and then their kids are starting in that new situation, and then they have a different situation. So the Saxons sort of famously or infamously, were fighting Charlemagne, and he was trying to Christianize them. About 100 years later, they were all loyal Christians who had nice
Yes.
things to say about Charlemagne. So, uh, you know, it,
Okay. Yeah.
it's you can sort of look at that from a variety of ways. That, like, well, um, like the Christianization effort, I suppose, of, you know, over time, like these people were ripe for it or whatever. But you can also look at it as like, Charlemagne Christianized these people and then they were Christian. And I kind of tend more towards that later view that,
Okay.
well, Clovis became Christian, so all the Franks became Christian. Like Clovis, nobody fooled around with that guy.
Yes.
If you disagreed with Clovis, he just put an axe in your head in front of everybody.
Yeah.
And so people didn't really mess with him. So once Clovis is Christian, like we're just doing Christianity now.
Okay. Yeah. So that's interesting too, and that goes back to what you were talking about earlier. Piety, and violence. Um,
Maybe this is a
you,
good point for me to read this little passage for you.
yes, please.
So this is from The Waning of the Middle Ages by Johann Huizinga. And just as a little background, I suppose this is talking about sort of what we've been talking about, this sort of paradox, which it'll end with here. He says, among the princes and the lords of the 15th century, more than one presents the type of an almost inconceivable mixture of devotion and debauchery. Louis of Orleans, brother of the French king, an insane lover of luxury and pleasure, addicted even to the sin of necromancy, has his cell in the common dormitory of the Celestines, those are monks, where he shares the privations and duties of monastic life, rising at midnight and sometimes hearing 5 or 6 masses a day. The coexistence in one person of devotion and worldliness is displayed in a striking fashion in Philip the Good, the Duke famous for his Molt Belle campaign of bastards, his extravagant feasts, his grasping policy, and for a pride not less violent than his temper, is at the same time strictly devout. He was in the habit of remaining in his oratory for a long time after Mass, and living on bread and water 4 days a week, as well as on all the vigils of Our Lady and the Apostles. He is often still fasting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He gives alms on a great scale and in secret. After the surprise of Luxembourg, he remains engrossed in his hours and special prayers of thanksgiving so long that his escort, awaiting him on horseback, grow impatient, for the fight was not quite yet over. On being warned of the danger, the Duke replies, "If God has granted me victory, he will keep it for me." Medieval nobles and princes represent so many different types of a very worldly and often frivolous temperament, coupled with a devotional spirit which one shrinks from stigmatizing as his hypocrisy or bigotry. It has rather to be regarded as a kind of reconciliation, hardly conceivable to the modern mind, between two moral extremes.
Mm. It. I don't know this if this is entirely fair. What I'm sort of thinking though, within the New Testament and that first chapter-ish of Romans and that idea, the apostle is saying, "What then should we sin so that God's grace is proven all the more?" And he says, "By no means," and yet. In sin, in the Christian conception, God's grace is proved all the more. Yeah.
It's kind of mind-boggling, to be honest. It's like
Yes.
hard. And when I like the first time, I mean, every time that I read it, I was getting chills reading that. I mean, it's like hard to wrap your head around this sort of conception of this guy who's going to 5 or 6 masses a day and is addicted to necromancy. Or
Yeah,
this kind of,
I
these
did
kind of
forget
crazy
about that
things.
part. Right.
It's like really hard to wrap your head around. I'll give you another one. There's another great passage here on Fulk, Fulk the Black. He was an early Count of Anjou. So this is in the early 11th century, celebrated as one of the first great builders of medieval castles. His most infamous act occurred in December 999, when he discovers that his wife, Elizabeth of Vendôme, had allegedly committed adultery with a local farmer. Before establishing the veracity of the accusation, Fulk had his wife burned at the stake, in her wedding dress, in the middle of a public square. His reputation didn't stop there, however. Fulk was a notorious robber baron who would stop at nothing to increase his territory or defend his interests. This was fairly run-of-the-mill amongst his peer group. It was kind of what medieval lords did, but Fulk always did things to the power of 10. The 10th century historian Henry Fichtenow has this to say about Fulk. Fulk of Anjou, plunderer, murderer, robber, and swearer of false oaths, a truly terrifying character of a fiendish cruelty, founded not one but two large abbeys. This Fulk was filled with an unbridled passion, a temper directed to extremes. Whenever he had the slightest difference with a neighbor, he rushed upon his lands, ravaging, pillaging, raping, and killing. Nothing could stop him, least of all the commandments of God. Yet, in Fichenou's quote lies the element where Fulk becomes even more interesting. The man who raped, pillaged, murdered, and broke oaths spent the rest of his time in acts of astonishing pilgrimage and piety. Fulk of Anjou was a devout Christian who built, enlarged, or endowed several abbeys and monasteries, such as the Abbey of Beaulieu-la-Loche, Saint Florent la Vale, Saint Aubin, and a convent, Notre Dame la Châterie at Roncenray in Angers. Though he never learned to write, he endowed a school with revenue to provide poor students with an education. He also undertook 4 pilgrimages to Jerusalem, first and second as a penitent seeking forgiveness for sins, and a third and fourth to protect pilgrims. And I should stipulate that one's not from the previous book. That's like from a blog post on him. But still, nonetheless, it's like a pilgrimage to Jerusalem was typically, especially as a pilgrim yourself, would probably be on foot. And so, and even if not on foot, he's still going from the middle of France, probably down through Italy, and then taking a several week-long, very perilous boat journey. And he did that 4 times there and back. So it's kind of like these types of things are kind of hard to wrap your head around. A guy
Very
who's so
much so.
savage, but at the same time, sort of doing these pilgrimages. This is why I sort of get frustrated with people who are cynical, because it's kind of hard to, wrap your head around taking let's say a year-long pilgrimage where you
Yes.
get nothing. There's no advantage to that for folk,
Right.
in terms of worldly materialism. So
And that's what does it, right? The cynicism, you could be cynical and say it was just it was a layer of power that they were putting onto themselves. They saw the way the wind was blowing, and Christianity would be the wind at their back and allow them greater power. But like you just said, when you take not only a year-long pilgrimage but 4 of them, when you take vast amounts of your wealth and pour it into not only the sustainment of the faith, but into the propagation of it. These things are curious.
the medieval mind is very paradoxical, I think, and it's very
Okay.
hard for us to really understand that sort of thing. Like he says, sort of these moral extremes at the same
Yes.
time.
So we've been going about an hour. I've got 3 questions if you have time for it. If
Sure.
not, it's
No,
okay.
go ahead.
Okay. So the first one is we have painted, we've laid out the map. We've put the pieces on the map. We have tried to display what it was that was making these pieces move. How do you get from these 2 extremes that we're talking about right now to Cromwell, to theology, not theology lived, but theology as a discipline? How do you move out of the medieval mindset into this sort of Puritanism, literally and figuratively?
Well, the period after the medieval period is not a specialty of mine, but I'll I suppose take a little bit of a crack at it. I think the increase in wealth, which as is much more easily seen in Rome or America, that allows sort of the division of labor, the administration, the bureaucracies. These kingdoms were becoming so large and so powerful that they started to need administrators, started to need more bureaucrats. They started to need more, for lack of a better word, administration. They were more populous. They were just getting bigger, and they were sort of consolidating. The kingdom of France let's say in the time of Philip Augustus, even is much smaller, and the royal domains are very insignificant, really. Um, Whereas, in the later period, where France is much more united and fighting, let's say the end of the Hundred Years' War, it's a big kingdom. It's much more united. They're all sort of universally falling under the King of France at that point. So you just need more administrators, and you're much more wealthier, and so you sort of end up with this, I suppose, like, cycle of empires where people are starting to get a little more divorced from uh, immediate reality, I suppose, maybe. There's other things that start to proliferate in the later period. The hiring of mercenaries and the rise of gunpowder, sort of at the same time, really, I think, damaged the influence of the elite, or the Christian elite, I suppose you could say. It's not all at once. It's a gradual transformation, and of course, there's huge variance where you get one guy who excuse me, is maybe very martial. Like you could have a Maximilian the First, the Holy Roman Emperor, and then I can't remember if it's his direct successor or one or two later, Charles V, who is basically not martial at all. I don't think he even fights in any battles. So you can sort of have this variance now because of the increased wealth and the gunpowder technology, which of course diminishes your individual prowess. And so the elites, obviously, from the time, starting very early in the period, the elites would, from the ages of 6 to 8 years old, begin training in the ways of war and how to kill people. And so they were quite literally professional killers, as kings and lords. In the later period, even to the degree that they still maintain some of that martial elitism, there's maybe diminishing returns is sort of the way to think about it, because gunpowder makes it very easy
Yeah.
to kill people,
That's an
and
awful way to think of it. Yeah.
mercenaries obviously is also very makes it easier to kill people. So you
Okay.
end up with, I think, diminishing returns on sort of this martial elite, the martial Christian elite. And so I would say, from my view, and then of course, I guess there's I guess maybe parts of the result of the schism, or I guess you end up with Martin Luther, maybe the knock-on effects of sort of the Reformation, is that the schism in the church obviously creates you end up with the wars of religion, which is pretty devastating, and breaks up a lot of these breaks up a lot of these powers, and sort of pits a lot of people against each other. I guess sort of famously as well with Cromwell and the King of England and Scotland, or James the First, I believe, or Charles the First, whoever he's fighting up there. Again, a little out of my wheelhouse, but that
Sure.
that would sort of be my,
Okay.
I guess, general, look at that idea of sort of how that all came to an end. For me, it kind of runs through those threads.
Are you familiar with John Slaughter at all?
I feel like I've seen him a little bit. I'm not really familiar
Yeah.
with his stuff.
He does the posting very much from a pro Southern standpoint. That's sort of his bread and butter is the Confederacy, the South, as well as just general cultural critiques. But the case you just laid out reminded me a lot of something he and I discussed last year, I believe it was, in sort of the death of the warrior, and it was his postulate that the identity of warriorhood, particularly the European variant, had died. And so it was interesting to hear the case you made for that, because I thought yeah, it carried a lot of those same bones, and that idea of gunpowder coming in and man, just knocking out the gains of any form of martial elite.
And yeah, I think, I guess maybe to put a little, to bring back something that I said earlier, I consider the end of the medieval period to be 1524, because that's the death of the Chevalier Bayard, and he's sort of the peak of knighthood, if you will.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Very good. All right. So this next question is just kind of a fun one, because we're living in interesting times. Okay. So Joe Kent, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Center, NCTC. Anyway, he writes to the president. He answers to the president. He is the head of this area, and he says, "Hey, I disagree with where we're at. I'm out." Is this something that could have even happened in medieval times, and what would that have meant for an advisor to say, I'm done, I'm out, I disagree with where we're at?
Well, it did happen in the medieval period. Actually, maybe that should be a little bit of a clarification. Is that the idea of absolute monarchy is actually an early modern period. That really starts with like Henry VIII, and sort of continues on through Louis XIV, and a lot of these guys that come later in the period. Medieval monarchy was much more, maybe not exactly first among equals, but a medieval king really relied upon the consensus of his vassals, and vassals could disagree with him, and they did sometimes, and or his various appointments and things. I actually, just the most recent podcast that I just released on the life of Saint Thomas Becket, he was Henry II's chancellor, which is basically like his sort of right hand man as far as administrative things go. He's writing off the letters, and sort of he's able to travel and govern in the king's name. Henry wanted him to, and they were, I guess they were kind of like Batman and Robin. They were just like a total team. They were on the same page. Everything was going great, with few exceptions, I suppose, where Thomas disagreed with him, like at the Siege of Toulouse. But Henry thought, which I guess maybe Henry actually, interestingly, he's pretty. I think a lot of people think Henry's pretty great. I'm sort of neither here nor there about him in particular, but Henry actually strikes me as somebody who you could say perhaps was a little bit cynical, or maybe not as earnest or pious as maybe other people. He pledged to go on crusade several times and didn't go. Just decided to send money instead. He actually didn't appoint, the king is supposed to appoint some of these bishops to fill these bishoprics and sort of run the church and stuff. He didn't appoint them, so that way he could sort of scoop the revenues for himself as much as extra would be available. And so, he's not the most pious guy, let's say. And so his idea is that he's got this partnership with Thomas Becket, and Thomas Becket is his man, unquestionably. And he's gonna install him as the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the preeminent church position in England. And then Thomas Becket, as his man, as the Archbishop of Canterbury, will be able to run his agenda in the church at the same time as he's running his agenda as a chancellor. He can do both at the same time, which is not unheard of. That's, you can sort of have people do whatever you want them to do, essentially. But some people say that Thomas Becket had some sort of conversion, some sort of divine inspiration after being appointed as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Other people say that maybe he just was put in this situation where he eventually just had to choose, and he chose to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. But yes, he shortly thereafter resigned his position as chancellor and really started fighting Henry on all the things that Henry wanted him to do in the church, as far as sort of exert his influence over the church. Sorry, excuse me. And I guess, we can see how that ended up. He ended up martyred, but by some of Henry's knights. Whether, to whatever degree Henry was involved in that is, I guess, still up for dispute. But yes,
only to the heavens.
In this circumstance, I suppose, Joe Kent maybe ends up martyred. I don't know, unless if he had some other office that he was then going against the sovereign with. I suppose I guess he just resigned. So it seems like Thomas Becket's resignation as chancellor wasn't necessarily the cause of his death. So maybe that's not quite right to say, but there's many other examples of Even Thomas Becket, when he was chancellor, he disagreed with Henry at the siege of Toulouse. Henry went the opposite way. Apparently that, caused a little bit of a kerfluffle, but after a short
Yes.
period, they were sort of back where they were. So, I think there was a lot of disagreement, and for the most part, um, as long as it wasn't treasonous, you sort of just moved on or got along otherwise or whatever was the case.
Yes. Okay. Very good. All right. So, last question for you. What is it that we can gather from a medieval worldview? Or maybe more pointed, what is it that we should gather, that we should meditate on from a medieval worldview? What is it that is applicable and that we should invest our time and our effort into?
Well, let me say I'm not big on learning lessons from history, generally speaking.
Interesting. Yeah, make that case too, please. If you know,
Well, I'm not saying you can't. To be
okay.
clear, I'm not saying the extreme that like there's no lessons to learn. I'm just saying that's not a big thing for me. I think
Yes.
that sort of idea that like, oh, we're going to learn a lesson from history. You can do that. But anybody can sort of learn any lesson they want from history in a way.
Okay.
It's sort of it's like a very subjective thing. Like I'm going to learn that I'm going to learn that doing this was bad because this guy died doing this, and somebody else would say,
Sure.
well, I'm going to learn the opposite thing, that doing the opposite was actually bad because some other guy died doing the opposite thing. So it's
It's
sort
sort
of
of post hoc rationalizing, and you've got all the cards
right,
laid out already. Okay.
right. But one thing that I will say though is that a big thing for me is that I think history should just be treated, which this is actually a medieval view, which I have come to adopt, is that history should be treated aspirationally, and that's why I focus on a lot of epic stories, I suppose, in my content, or sort of these epic figures, is because I think history should be aspirational. We should be looking at these great figures who came before us and aspire to rise to their levels. And the medievals thought this and did this as well. One that I didn't mention was the Song of Roland. Roland was a very influential figure past his death that influenced a lot of knights and warriors who aspired to fight to the death. And so I think,
Julius weeping at the statue of Alexander.
yeah, and that's another one. Yep. And so I think, that this is one of the reasons I posted about today. Actually, I post a lot about this book called Dueling Stories of the 16th Century, which is technically not medieval, but it's all about dueling, which is very medieval. And the vitality that you experience by reading that book is incomprehensible levels, I would say. And what's really powerful about it is that it's eyewitness accounts, it's stories that Brantome saw or that he heard from other people. For the most part, he talks. There's a handful of sort of historical examples, but most of the stories in the book are people that he knew or stories of duels that he heard from people that he knew. And some of these stories are just, it's these guys are just operating on levels that you can't comprehend. And it's this is where sort of we get back into the paradox of the modern mind, because there'll be stories of duels where you have the duelists, the two people who have the conflict and are going to fight, and then you have their seconds, which are sort of their representatives to organize and make sure that the duel is fair. And in some cases, you even have thirds who are sort of supporters for the seconds. So you might have duelists and seconds and thirds, and there's stories in there where he talks about these famous duels where the seconds and thirds, after the duelists start fighting to the death, the seconds and thirds say something to the effect of, we can't let these guys have all the fun. And then they start fighting to the death themselves. And most of them get killed. And this is sort of something that, it's very easy, I think, for us to say something like that is very stupid. And, you can sort of, I guess this goes to sort of the materialist view, like, wow, that's very stupid. But at the same time, it's that type of energy that is what propelled the West to the great heights over other civilizations and other societies through that period, and through the periods that came afterwards, is sort of this, uh, for lack of a better word, phrase, I guess, ridiculous vitality. Just not being afraid, aspiring to be the best. There's another story in the book of
That's the Chesterton quote. Now that I'm thinking about it, isn't it?
which
I
one?
think it's Chester. I believe it's Chesterton that goes on about courage. Go ahead. I'm sorry I cut you off, but
Yeah,
while
you're
you
right.
do that, I'm going to try and find this Chesterton quote I'm thinking.
There's a story in the book of this guy who, a bunch of guys are all sort of sitting around, and these guys have a disagreement, and the guy says, "You know what? We should fight to the death about it right now," basically. And some other guy comes up and says, like, "Hey, you can't fight this guy to the death. This guy's my friend. You think I'm going to stand here and let you fight him? Like, he and I are going to cut you up if you think you're going to start something right here." And he just stands up and goes, "All right, let's go. I'll take both of you on right now." And apparently everybody sort of got involved and like separated them and whatever. But somebody came up to this guy. His name's like Gensack, I think. He was a Gascon. And somebody came up to him after the fact and said, like, "Hey man, like, what are you thinking? Like, you're going to fight two guys at once? Like, that's, everybody's a trained fighter. So there's, you can think about it as like, like
Yes.
if you got like, you know, three MMA guys in a room and one guy's like, I'll take both of you on at the same time. It's like, these are trained killers. So that's like this is not like a casual, this is not like an NBA guy talking to two high schoolers or something. Somebody says like, "Hey man, like, what's the deal with that? Like, why are you're going to get killed? Like, what are you thinking?" And he goes, "Well, that's, how else are you going to get remembered? Like, I want to be remembered in the chronicles," is what he says. And that's sort of is always going through my mind, this kind of energy that this guy is, he's willing to stand up in the middle of this thing and fight two guys to the death, just because he's so motivated to be remembered by the chronicles. He so badly wants, to do something notable that people will talk about. And that sort of energy is, I mean, you know, people have a lot of complaints today, and a lot of them are justifiable. I don't want to say like I'm not making a comment on people's complaints. Like, oh, I'm getting discriminated against, or like things are tougher now. The economy's worse now than it was for my parents. I'm not arguing any of that. All of it can be true, and that's fine. But like when you read about these guys who built the society that we now live in, and they were willing to throw themselves, to fight to the death just to be remembered for a moment, just to be, so somebody would read about, this crazy battle that this crazy fight that they did, this, it's just, they're just operating on a different level, than, sort of where people are now when they're complaining, I
Yes.
suppose, which, I'm not trying to dump on anybody who's complaining. To be clear, what I'm trying to say is that, like this sort of, it's a window into like the levels that these guys were operating on, and we should aspire to that.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. So it reminded me of two different quotes. One is from Jack London. It comes from The Call of the Wild, and it's, "There is an ecstasy that marks the summit of life, and beyond which life cannot rise. And such is the paradox of living. This ecstasy comes when one is most alive, and it comes as a complete forgetfulness that one is alive." So that was London. And then you'll forgive me, this Chesterton one's a little bit long, but I I find it interesting.
Yeah, go for
I'm
it.
going to breeze through the first portion of it. It says, "Take the case of courage," and then he lays out a case. "No quality has ever such addled the brains and tangled the definitions of merely rational sages." He goes on a little bit about it, and then he says, "The paradox is the whole principle of courage, even of quite earthly or brutal courage. A man cut off by the sea may save his life if he will risk it on the precipice. He can only get away from death by continually stepping within an inch of it. A soldier surrounded by enemies, if he is to cut his way out, needs to combine a strong desire for living with a strange carelessness about dying. He must not merely cling to life, for then he will be a coward, and will not escape. He must not merely wait for death, for then he will be a suicide, and he will not escape. He must seek his life in a spirit of furious indifference to it. He must desire life like water, and yet drink death like wine. So,
Yep. Yeah, if I recall, I believe Xenophon wrote about, in his March of the 10,000, about how the soldiers that wanted to live and were like worried and tried
yes,
their best to survive were the ones who died, and the guys who just didn't even care, those were the guys who lived.
right. Yeah, there is certainly something to that. Hey, this was great. This was fantastic. Where can people find your work? You do streaming. You are on X. How can people plug in, be inspired, and see what's going on with your interactions with the medieval times?
I appreciate it. Thank you. And thanks for having me on again. They can find me on Twitter, of course. It's at Memory Medieval. And Substack is really the home for all of my stuff, which is also at Memory Medieval. And if you could be a free subscriber there, and you'll get an email for all the podcasts. You could see the notes, which are a lot of the same things that I cross post from Twitter. And you'll also get an email for any important updates, like the magazine or the cards or anything like that.
Yes, perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much. I am going to update the description because I don't have your Substack in there. I believe I have your YouTube channel and your X account, but we get that Substack figured out. All right. I greatly appreciate it. Gentlemen, you have a good evening. Thanks to everybody that tuned in, and we will see you later.